Persia was not supposed to end like this. Not with silence on the roads, not with frightened cities waiting behind half-opened gates, not with a king moving east because he could no longer keep the center still. For generations, Persia had looked like the natural shape of the world. Its power ran across deserts, mountains, rivers, and seas. Armies marched beneath its banners, tribute crossed its roads, palaces rose from stone terraces as if time itself had been ordered to kneel. And then the unthinkable began. In 334 BC, a foreign king crossed from the west into Asia. He was young, fast, and relentless. But this story is not really about him. It is about what it feels like when a civilization that once looked eternal begins to realize it can die. This is the fall of Persia. There was a time when Persia seemed beyond reach. The Achaemenid Empire was vast, disciplined, and rich beyond imagination. It ruled many peoples without needing to erase them. Languages survived beneath it. Religions survived beneath it. Trade moved beneath it. That was part of its strength. Persia did not only conquer, it organized, it connected. It turned distance into administration, and tribute into order. Royal roads tied the empire together, and along them moved horses, silver, grain, timber, messengers, soldiers, and imperial commands. For more than 2 centuries, this system had held. And above it all stood the image of certainty, Persepolis, a place of stone, ceremony, and memory, a place built not just for rulers, but for the idea of rule itself. Delegations climbed its stairways in carved relief. Columns rose into bright, ceremonial air. Empty halls still seemed full of power. Persia is still here. Persia will remain. That was the promise, and promises like that are most dangerous just before they break. Empires rarely fall at the moment they look weakest. They often fall while still looking grand. That is what makes collapse so hard to recognize. From a distance, the roads are still there, the court is still there, the king is still there, and the wealth is still there. The shape remains. The confidence does not. Something underneath had changed. The machine was heavier now. Orders traveled, but not as cleanly. Men still obeyed, but not with the same conviction. Provinces still answered, though more slowly than before. Persia was not empty, not defenseless, and not already dead, but it was tired. Darius III inherited that kind of empire, not a ruined one, a strained one. That difference matters because the fall of Persia was not the story of a giant struck down in one blow. It was the story of a giant discovering too late that its balance had already begun to fail. Then came the invasion. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor with an army far smaller than the empire he meant to challenge. By size alone, Persia should have been able to absorb him. That was precisely why the danger was easy to misread. At first, this could still have looked manageable, just another threat at the edge of imperial space, a Western king, a hard push, a problem to be slowed and contained. But Alexander moved too quickly for that. He did not let Persia settle itself. He did not allow early defeats to remain local. He kept advancing, forcing the empire to react before it had found its balance. That was his real weapon. Not magic, Not destiny, momentum. Before the empire had fully decided what he was already deeper inside it. Dust rose on roads that should have felt secure, messengers arrived faster, armor carried the grit of hurried campaigns, and once fear begins moving through an empire, it changes everything. A defeat becomes a rumor becomes doubt, doubt becomes hesitation, and hesitation in war can kill more surely than a spear. The first defeats did not destroy Persia, but they changed the air inside the empire. What should have been contained was not contained. What should have been a warning began to look like a pattern. Alexander won early, and early victories in an imperial war are dangerous in ways numbers do not show, because defeat spreads faster than reinforcements. News outruns armies. A satrap listens more carefully to bad reports. A city begins to calculate. An officer waits for orders that come too slowly. On a moonlit road, a rider pushes his horse hard toward a gate that is already opening before he reaches it. This is how great powers begin to fracture. Not all at once, in layers. And by the time Darius himself had to confront the crisis directly, this was no longer a distant military problem. The war was moving inward. In 333 BC, at Issus, the war changed. This was the moment when the king himself faced the invader and failed to reverse the movement of the conflict. What had been an advancing threat was now becoming a test of whether the empire could still steady itself under its ruler. It could not. Issus did more than produce defeat. It damaged confidence at the center. Darius survived, but survival was no longer enough. The empire needed him to restore calm, to halt the drift, to make the old certainty believable again. He could not do that. And once the king cannot reverse momentum, the war begins to feel different to everyone beneath him. Officers hear the news differently. Cities hear it differently. Families hear it differently. Somewhere in the dark, a mother listening for hoofbeats at night no longer knows whether the riders will bring reassurance or ruin. There are military defeats a great empire can survive. But when the ruler fails to turn retreat into confidence, something more dangerous begins. First, it loses certainty. Then came Gaugamela in 331 BC. If Issus had shown that the king could not reverse the momentum, Gaugamela showed something worse. The imperial center itself was exposed, and the endgame had begun. This was no longer a hard campaign on the edges. It was no longer a wound the empire could hide behind distance. Now the struggle had reached the point where the old illusion of safety no longer worked. There are defeats an empire can survive, but there are images it cannot survive. A king in retreat can become one of those images, because once the ruler no longer looks like the fixed center of power, the spell begins to break. Men fight differently when they believe the world behind them is solid. They fight differently when they believe their ruler can still hold the future in place. After Gaugamela, Persia's future no longer looked solid. What had been invasion became imperial crisis. What had been imperial crisis now became visible unraveling. The empire was no longer just losing battles, it was losing the argument that it would endure. After that, the collapse moved through the empire in human ways. Babylon submitted. Susa fell. Gates opened. Treasures changed hands. What had once moved toward the great king now passed into the possession of a foreign conqueror. That reversal mattered as much as any battlefield. This is the quieter violence of imperial collapse. Banners may still fly, orders may still be issued, the empire may still exist on a map, But on the ground, people are already adjusting to a new reality. A palace servant hears whispers through long corridors and realizes even the powerful are afraid. A provincial official delays one decision too long. A messenger arrives at dusk, covered in dust, and before he speaks, everyone already understands the news is bad. An old man who has lived his whole life beneath Persian rule begins to understand that his grandchildren may not. That is what the fall of an empire feels like. Not grand, not clean, not the way monuments remember it. It feels like uncertainty entering ordinary life. And somewhere on the roads eastward, Darius keeps moving, trying to gather what can still be gathered. But events are moving faster than he is. Then came the image that would outlive generations. Persepolis burning. Not merely a city, not merely a royal complex, the ceremonial heart of the empire, the place where Persia had staged its permanence in stone. By the time Alexander reached the royal heartland, the old illusion of safety had already broken. But what happened next gave that break a face the world would remember. Fire. Flames climbing past carved terraces, smoke rising into the dark above the columns, the red glow of destruction moving over reliefs that had once shown subject peoples bringing tribute to the king. Empty ceremonial halls filling with heat, sparks, and ash. In the fire, Persia loses more than architecture. It loses dignity. It loses ceremony. It loses the old image of itself. This was more than conquest. It was exposure. It was humiliation made visible. It was the old order burning brightly enough that no one could pretend it still stood untouched. If the earlier defeats had wounded Persia, Persepolis made the wound unforgettable. After Persepolis, the empire still had space. It still had fragments of authority. It still had a king. But now Darius was no longer moving to restore confidence. He was moving because the center had collapsed behind him. Eastward he went, hoping distance might buy time, loyalty, or one last gathering of strength. But empires do not recover simply because their ruler survives. They recover when enough people still believe survival means something. Too many no longer did. And this is where the tragedy becomes quieter. Not in the blaze of a palace, in abandonment. The old machinery of obedience begins to loosen. Men think first of self-preservation. Officials protect themselves before they protect the order they serve. The empire does not die in one scream. It thins out around its ruler. Eventually, Darius is left not as the master of collapse, but as its most visible victim. That is one of the saddest endings in imperial history. Not that Persia lost. Every empire loses sooner or later. But that its king became a fugitive before he became a memory. Alexander won. That cannot be denied. He moved faster than Persia could stabilize. He struck before fear could cool. He understood that momentum, once it begins to work in your favor, can become a weapon sharper than bronze. That is why he matters in this story. But he did not create Persia's every weakness. He did not invent its exhaustion. He did not invent the strain of ruling too much land through too many hands for too long. He did not invent the widening gap between imperial grandeur and imperial confidence. He exposed those weaknesses. He accelerated them. He forced the empire into moments it could no longer manage. That is different from saying he alone destroyed it. And that difference matters, because Persia was not only defeated from the outside, it was failing from within. If we miss that, then we turn a civilizational collapse into a legend about one man. It was always more tragic than that. So how did Persia fall? Not in one charge, not in one night, not because history chose a single hero and a single loser. It fell in stages. A Western king crossed into Asia. Early defeats shook the edges. At Issus, the king failed to reverse the momentum. At Gaugamela, the imperial center stood exposed. Persepolis burned. The king fled east. Loyalty thinned. The old order ended. That is the spine of the story. But the truth of it is simpler and colder. Persia did not die when the fire rose. It died when too many people inside the empire stopped believing the center could still hold.